Hi, I'm Elena Brooks, and this isn't just a story about a family estate. It's about what happens when the people who raised you decide you no longer belong in the legacy they built because you refused to play small. For 10 years, my name was left off every invite, every family group chat, every photo on the wall. They said I was too distant, too cold, too busy. But behind my back, they called me a liability, said I didn't fit the family brand. And this Christmas, they hosted a century-old reunion at the house I grew up in without even mentioning my name. But what they didn't know was that I owned the deed. Wait, before we go any further, where are you watching from? They say the holidays are for family, for fireplaces and warm pie for laughter echoing through halls filled with garlands and old secrets. But for me, Christmas always came with silence. The kind that rings louder than any carol. My name is Elena Brooks, and last December I wasn't invited again. It wasn't the first time. It had been a pattern for years. Slipped invites, group photos where I'd been cropped out, voicemails that never got returned. But somehow this one felt colder. Maybe because it was supposed to be the Brooks family Christmas centennial, a once-in-a-generation gathering at our ancestral estate in Vermont. A place where every wall knew my childhood, where I once tied bows on banisters taller than me. The house that had always been ours, until I realized I wasn't part of us anymore. The invitation came indirectly. A friend from college texted me, "Did you see your mom's post? Christmas looks insane this year." I opened Instagram and there it was, a carousel of photos, snow-covered trees, candlelit dinner tables, a caption that read, "Coming home to legacy. Brooks family Christmas 100 years strong." My stomach dropped. I hadn't heard a word. I searched my inbox anyway. Maybe they sent it to the wrong address. Maybe there was a mix-up. There wasn't. My name wasn't on the email thread, not even BCC, not even a forgotten Elena in the group chat, just cold digital air. At first I told myself it didn't matter. I had a life, a company, a view of Manhattan they'd never stepped foot in. But the truth was heavier. I wasn't angry. I was numb. And that's always more dangerous. You see, I used to be part of it all. Before the fallouts, before the boardroom politics and family real estate disputes, before they rewrote the narrative, turned me from youngest partner to emotionally unavailable. They said I worked too much, that I made them uncomfortable with my directness, that I didn't nurture the family spirit. Translation, I stopped playing small. Still a part of me had held out hope that maybe this Christmas someone would reach out. A text, a call, even a mistake. But silence spoke first, it always does. I sat alone that night with my coffee, watching the city lights flicker against the window pane. In the background, my TV played some feel-good movie where estranged daughters get hugged at the door and everything gets solved over hot cocoa. I muted it. What they didn't know, what they never bothered to ask, was that I wasn't avoiding them. I was surviving them. There's a difference. I kept receipts, and not just the emotional kind. Legal ones, financial ones, paperwork with signatures they probably forgot they gave. They thought I had nothing. Just distance bitterness, maybe some buried resentment. But I had records, and leverage, and time. What's ironic is that the estate they were celebrating in, where they were stringing lights and singing around the old grand piano, was tied to a trust I knew inside out. Because my grandmother left it that way, quietly, deliberately for me. But this part of the story isn't about revenge. Not yet. This part is about the ache before the fire. The hollow quiet of realizing your name means less than the chandelier your great-grandfather bought. It's about realizing that tradition doesn't include you unless you play your role exactly. Smile, nod, say nothing. I stopped doing that years ago. So no, I didn't crash the party. I didn't call anyone. I didn't text Merry Christmas just to be polite. I opened my laptop, pulled up the family holding company registry, and started rereading everything that still had my name on it. They'd mistaken silence for absence. That was their first mistake. Have you ever been excluded by your own family? Drop a 1 if you felt it too, or 2 if you think some boundaries are necessary. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was sad, not anymore. I'd already buried that kind of ache years ago, the day they voted me off the board under the guise of restructuring. No, this time it was something else entirely: clarity. The kind of stillness that comes when everything finally makes sense. I sat on the floor of my apartment with a glass of Merlot in one hand and a pile of old documents in the other. The kind no one else in my family ever bothered to read. They liked symbols, portraits, plaques, family crests. But I preferred signatures, clauses, fine print. That's where the real stories lived. It was there, buried in a notarized packet from 12 years ago, that I saw it again: my grandmother's trust, a dense beige folder with my name scrawled in her Lupin cursive for Elena when they forget who you are. I'd tucked it away after she passed, too overwhelmed by grief and legal jargon to open it properly. Now the pages looked like prophecy. She hadn't left me a grand gesture, no spotlight, no announcement, just something much quieter: control and interest in the family holding company, activated only under very specific conditions. One of those conditions, if the company defaulted on taxes for more than 2 consecutive quarters. I cross-checked the most recent public filings, which legally they still had to disclose under the private incorporation laws of our state. My pulse slowed as I read the numbers: 2 missed quarters, quiet, careless, avoidable, and absolutely real, which meant the clause was in play. I wasn't a lawyer, but I didn't have to be. I knew the game because I'd helped build the rule book before they shut me out. I was the one who designed the old succession plans, who stayed up late reading state statutes when my brothers went out for drinks and my mother retreated into curated grief after my father passed. They assumed I'd be too busy or too hurt to notice what they'd let rot. They were wrong. The most ironic part: they didn't even want the company. Not really. My brother Mason had been trying to flip the real estate wing for months, turn it into quick cash. Meanwhile, my mother held on only for sentiment, pretending it was about family legacy when really it was about image. They were bleeding capital and no one was paying attention, except me. I sent an email to my lawyer that same night with the subject line, Activation of Trust Clause B-17. I didn't need a meeting. I didn't need to ask for permission. The clause allowed for direct petition to assume interim control pending legal confirmation. No one had to agree. They just had to be notified. The next morning, I dressed in navy slacks and a crisp white button-up, not to impress, just to remind myself who I'd become. I poured coffee, sat by the window, and watched the city breathe under a thin veil of frost. Then I opened my laptop again, drafted the first memo. Simple. Surgical. As per Trust B-17, I am initiating the process of interim control due to breach of tax obligations. No emotion, no drama, just fact. That's how you win without lifting your voice. While they posted wreaths and heirloom ornaments on social media, I spent the next 72 hours working in silence, auditing, reviewing transfer protocols, calling the bank that still had my name on the dormant board account. The woman on the phone asked, "Oh, you're still on this?" I smiled faintly. Apparently I am. What struck me most wasn't the power, it was how little effort it took. All these years they had treated me like an outsider. And yet, when it came down to the legal fabric of what we owned, I was stitched in tighter than any of them realized. My grandmother hadn't left me the crown. She'd left me the key ring, and all I had to do was unlock the right door. The final piece was scheduling a quiet, no-notice audit of the estate property itself, the one they were using for the Christmas celebration. Under the terms of the holding company's charter, any use of company property during transition was subject to review, which meant that while they toasted champagne in the Great Hall, I was finalizing a list of assets under my jurisdiction. Still, I didn't say a word. I didn't text anyone. I didn't warn them. Because it was never about revenge, not the loud kind. It was about recognition, about walking into a room and knowing I didn't have to ask to belong there. My name was already in the foundation. Do you think some legacies speak louder in silence? Drop a 1 if you agree, or 2 if you believe family should be fought for out loud. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, everything was in place. My name wasn't on the guest list, but it was on the contract, on the holding papers, on the bank authorization form, on the deed. The estate they gathered in, I had just signed the documents, placing it under review. They wouldn't know. Not yet. Not until the front desk staff politely asked whether they were authorized guests under the new management. That was coming. But this quiet prelude was for me. Let them drink, let them dance, let them forget I existed. They'd remember soon. There's a special kind of humiliation that doesn't scream, it whispers. It hides in plain sight, tucked behind polite smiles and passive omissions. That's how they did it. Always. Never confrontational, never loud, just consistent silence, a silence so rehearsed it became second nature. That's what made it cruel and effective. It was December 23rd when I got the screenshot, sent from an old colleague turned friend, Ava. She used to work under my mother back when the company still had an HR department worth respecting. We hadn't spoken in months, but she still checked in occasionally. No preamble this time, just an image. It was from a private group chat titled Core Brooks Only. The title alone felt like a slap. The message inside was worse. Trinity Lana is not coming again. Let's just move forward without the drama this time. Mason, okay. Aunt Camille, blessing in disguise. My mother, it's just easier this way. I stared at the screen. Easier for whom I didn't respond to Ava. I didn't need to. She knew what this meant. Not just exclusion, but erasure. It wasn't that they forgot me, it was that they had rewritten me. I wasn't the daughter who helped keep the family business afloat during the last recession. I wasn't the one who flew cross-country to help manage estate affairs after Dad died. I was now the dramatic one, the problem they were relieved to avoid. And yet, for people who claimed to want peace, they talked about me a lot. That night, I sat with the screenshot glowing on my phone, the city pulsing quietly outside my apartment window. It wasn't rage I felt. Rage is too generous. Rage still believes in something to save. What I felt was clarity, that cold surgical clarity that hits when a part of you dies and you let it. I opened my laptop and logged into the portal. The company's internal database still had my credentials from the trust activation, property schedule and asset access staff instructions. I navigated to the estate calendar. Every guest room had been assigned, every meal planned. My name was nowhere, not even in the system as a visitor, just a footnote in their digital world. I scrolled until I found the master suite still listed as unoccupied, the same room my grandmother used to stay in, the room with the wraparound view of the lake and the fireplace carved with our family crest. I hovered over the assigned guest field, then I typed Miss Elena Brooks, owner. Room preferences, firm pillows, white cotton sheets, Perrier-Jouet, chilled upon arrival, full privacy requested, click. Confirmation loaded, no fireworks, no dramatic music, just quiet acknowledgement from the system that legally I had every right to be there. That room wasn't just a bed, it was a statement. I leaned back in my chair and let the irony settle. While they passed judgment in their insulated echo chamber, I was confirming their stay, approving catering invoices, reviewing guest transportation receipts they didn't know required my signature. It had never occurred to them to ask who controlled the infrastructure beneath their traditions. That's the thing about power, it's rarely loud. True power operates quietly, buried in spreadsheets and trust documents, waiting for the moment someone assumes it doesn't exist. And they had assumed I didn't exist. The next day, Trinity posted a video on her Instagram. She panned across the estate lawn, snow falling lightly over pine trees dusted like confection sugar. Her voice trilled in the background. Christmas at the Brooks estate. Nothing like it. Generations of tradition. She paused dramatically, then added, grateful to be with the people who matter most. Subtle. In the comments, relatives I hadn't spoken to in years chimed in. Wish we were there. So beautiful. Elena must be busy again, Lowell. I didn't comment, I didn't like, I didn't watch it twice. I just screenshotted the clip and saved it in a folder labeled receipts. Not for revenge, not even for court if it ever came to that. Just for the record. A catalog of how they spoke when they thought I couldn't hear. And what struck me most wasn't the cruelty, it was the laziness. They hadn't evolved their tactics in 10 years. Still gossip, still group chats, still pretending my absence was a mutual agreement. They had built their story and I was simply a shadow too inconvenient to remember, too inconvenient to invite. But shadows don't stay still forever. Sometimes they move. Have you ever seen people rewrite you in their story while you're still alive to witness it? Drop a 1 if yes, or 2 if you think people eventually show their true colors. By midnight, I had scheduled my arrival time at the estate for the following day, exactly 20 minutes after their official check-in window. I didn't need an audience, I just needed timing. It wasn't about making a scene, it was about making them see. They didn't know I was coming. That's what made it perfect. The estate had always been more than a property. It was a symbol of unity, of legacy, of control. It was where deals were whispered over bourbon, where daughters were posed beside fireplaces and holiday cards, where my father used to give speeches about what it meant to be a Brooks. I used to believe him. Now I just remember how he stopped calling me kiddo the year I turned 29 and voted against Mason's expansion plan, the year I stopped being useful. When my grandmother passed, everyone assumed Mason would inherit the decision-making. He was the eldest, the loudest, the most marketable. But Grandma was a different breed. She didn't believe in appearances. She believed in intention. And somewhere between her baking lemon bars and studying estate law in her 70s, she had put something away just for me. A trust clause buried in legal detail, waiting for a specific moment, financial delinquency tied to mismanagement. That moment was now. The day before Christmas Eve, I stood outside the offices of McAllister and Grant, the law firm she'd used for decades. The receptionist didn't flinch when I gave my name. She simply nodded and said, "Mr. Bellamy is expecting you." That's when I knew. My grandmother had set this in motion long before she died. The partner who met me was polite but curious. "You're the youngest, Brooks," he said, flipping through the folder labeled with my initials, "not the one we usually see in these matters." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm here." He tapped one clause with a gold Mont Blanc pen. "This is your leverage. It gives you interim control upon proof of non-compliance." "I have the records," I said, sliding over the tax filings, the lapses, the failed audit. "I just need the form." He nodded slowly, the kind of nod that means this won't be contested successfully. "You sign this," he said, "and in 14 business days, the title shifts, no loopholes. Unless someone can prove coercion, which from what I see, they can't." I signed, cleanly, no hesitation, no hand tremor. I wasn't just reclaiming property, I was reclaiming the truth, that I had never walked away. I had simply stopped asking for permission to belong. When I left the office, I didn't go home. I drove north, no music, no calls, just the rhythm of tires on winter asphalt and the steady beat of something old burning out inside me. By the time I reached the estate, I didn't feel nervous. I felt like I was arriving late to a party I was hosting in silence. They were already there, of course. I saw their cars lined up neatly along the long gravel driveway, expensive, over-polished. The kind of cars that say, "Look at us, we're doing just fine." I parked around the corner and waited, watching through the windshield as Mason laughed too loudly by the trunk of his Audi, as Trinity adjusted her coat for Instagram, as my mother hovered expression tight and unreadable. I gave them 10 minutes, then I walked. The front desk manager didn't recognize me until I handed her my ID. Her brows lifted slightly, then smoothed. "Ah," she said under her breath. "You're the one." "Yes," I said simply. "I'm the one." Behind me, I could hear Trinity arguing with the concierge, her voice rising shrill, offended. "What do you mean I'm not on the registry? This is our house." The concierge didn't flinch. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Only guests listed under the new ownership can be checked in." "New ownership," Trinity repeated as if the words were in a foreign language. I stepped forward, then letting the sound of my boots on polished stone do half the talking. The concierge smiled politely and handed me the key card. "Welcome back, Miss Brooks." Trinity turned color, draining from her face. "You—" "Yes," I said. "Me?" Mason frowned, stepping forward. "What kind of stunt is this?" I didn't answer. I held up the key card. The room number gleamed gold against black plastic. "The house was never yours," I said. "It was just leased to your assumptions. They didn't move, didn't shout. That's the thing about people who are always in control. They freeze when the script flips." "You're not serious," my mother said finally. I met her eyes unflinching. "Check the mail, or the trust, or the tax records." "Doesn't really matter now, does it?" Silence settled like snowfall. Not dramatic, not explosive, just final. I walked past them toward the grand staircase. The smell of cedar and old pine filled the air familiar, sharp. Each step I climbed wasn't just movement, it was reclamation. I wasn't making an entrance, I was making a point. At the top of the stairs, I paused and looked back once. "You should have read the contract," I said quietly. Then I turned the corner and disappeared down the hall, keycard in hand, the contract legally binding the history rewritten. Not in ink, in ownership. The master suite smelled like memory, faint lavender from old sachets still tucked in the dresser, a trace of fireplace smoke clinging to the curtains, and something else, something deeper, the residue of being remembered even when the living tried to forget you. I closed the door behind me slowly. The click of the lock wasn't about privacy, it was about finality. This had been my grandmother's room, the one place in the entire estate where I'd once felt seen. I was 8 the first time she let me sleep here. Everyone else was downstairs playing board games and drinking cider, and I had slipped away after Mason told me to stop talking. She found me curled up in a hallway corner and brought me here without a word. She lit at the fireplace, tucked me under her quilt, and whispered, "They may be louder, Elena, but that doesn't make them right." That was the kind of woman she was, quiet power wrapped in cashmere. She didn't raise her voice, she adjusted the room until people leaned in to hear her. I took after her more than I ever realized. Maybe that's why they all preferred to forget she left this house under my name. I moved through the room, slowly running my fingers along the edges of the old mahogany desk, the bookshelf filled with first editions, the carved headboard with initials etched underneath from a different century. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The contract had gone through. The trust clause had been validated. The estate, the land it sat on, the title, the rights, it was mine now. Legally, permanently, no appeal, no boardroom debate. They could fume all they wanted downstairs, complain about disrespect, betrayal, poor taste, but they wouldn't change the ink that had already dried. And the best part, I hadn't forced anything. I didn't scheme, I didn't trick. I followed their rules better than they ever did. That's what made it sting. On the vanity sat a glass tray with 2 cut crystal flutes and a bottle of Perrier-Jouet, just as I'd requested. The house manager had followed my notes exactly. I popped the cork with a steady hand, poured a half glass, and let the bubbles rise in silence. Outside the window, snow fell in steady spirals covering the estate grounds like a white lie no one wanted to admit. I sipped slowly. This wasn't celebration, it was ceremony. The fireplace crackled to life after I turned the dial. I settled into the old velvet armchair facing the flames. In my lap sat a folder, one I'd brought intentionally, one they would never think to request. It contained documents from the last 2 years of their mismanagement. Tax penalties, maintenance lapses, quiet resignations from staff who cited toxic leadership in anonymous HR exit forms. No one read them, of course. They had stopped checking the reports the day I left the board. But I read them. I kept everything. It hadn't been hard to take control. All it took was attention and patience. They'd always underestimated both. When I was still on the board, Mason once joked that I was just the finance girl, said it during a quarterly review in front of 3 junior partners. I laughed it off then, pretended not to care. But I remembered, not out of spite, but for context. This was always about context. They believed legacy came from volume, how many years you showed up, how many toasts you gave, how loudly you defended the Brooks name at charity galas. But I knew better. Legacy isn't volume, it's record. It's proof. And I had the kind they couldn't delete. Downstairs, laughter echoed faintly up the grand staircase. I heard Mason's voice, sharp and restless. Trinity asking where the event photographer had gone. Someone clinking glasses too loudly, hoping to pretend everything was still theirs. They hadn't asked me to leave. Not yet. That would come eventually, lightly with a lawyer's letter written in haste and hubris. But for now, they were still frozen, still spinning behind the reality they didn't want to face. I stood and walked to the door, opened it just a crack. The hallway was empty, but the house was a choice. It always knew when the balance had shifted. Back inside, I opened the desk drawer. Just as I remembered a small stack of stationery, my grandmother's monogram, pressed in gold at the top, I pulled out a sheet, uncapped a pen, and began to write. Not to them. They didn't need words, it was to her. The woman who left me the one thing no one else dared give authority, without noise. I didn't write a letter, just a sentence. I didn't make a scene, I made a decision. I folded the paper and placed it back in the drawer under the stationery where maybe someone would find it one day. Or maybe not, it didn't matter, because this house, this place, full of rooms they thought I would never enter again, was mine, and they would feel that with every step they took on these floorboards, with every light switch that worked because I paid the utility bill, with every catered dish that was approved under my vendor list, with every glass of wine served from a cellar I now controlled. They could refuse to say my name, but the house would say it for them, over and over, quietly, permanently, without apology. The next morning, Christmas Eve, began like any other in the mountains' muted gray skies, soft wind sifting through evergreens, and a kind of calm that always felt like it was waiting to be broken. I woke before dawn, not out of restlessness, but precision. Timing in these situations was everything. I dressed with intent. Dark wool coat, black boots, a soft gray scarf my grandmother once knitted for me. During the year, she quietly changed the terms of the family trust. No jewelry, no statement bag. I wasn't coming as someone desperate to be noticed. I was walking into my property like someone who no longer owed anyone an explanation. By the time I reached the estate lobby, their voices were already floating through the front entrance forced. Cheer rehearsed affection. I recognized Trinity's laugh first, a little too high, a little too loud, the kind she used when cameras were nearby or when she was lying. I stepped inside just as the front desk receptionist was explaining something to Mason, who stood stiff with that performative calm he'd always relied on. Behind him, my mother clutched a clipboard of seating charts, and my uncle was busy instructing one of the housekeepers to find more ice as if anything about this day was normal. "Sorry," the receptionist said, glancing down at the iPad. "You're not listed on the guest registry under the new ownership." Trinity blinked. "New ownership?" Mason tilted his head. "This is the Brooks estate. There's no new ownership." The receptionist shifted awkwardly. "Actually, sir, the transfer of title was finalized last week. The legal paperwork came from McAllister and Grant." Silence. You could hear it spread across the lobby like spilled wine. Then the soft click of my boots on marble. I walked toward them calm and deliberate, my breath steady. Trinity turned first. Her face froze mid-sentence. "Alana morning," I said simply. Mason took a step forward. "What is this?" "The registry's correct," I said. "You're not listed as guests." "I am." My mother stared at me like I had risen from the grave. "This is some kind of joke." "No," I replied, eyes on her now. "It's a correction." Mason scoffed. "You can't seriously think you're going to hijack Christmas with some piece of paper and a technicality." I handed the front desk clerk my ID. She took it with both hands, visibly relieved to have someone acting like an adult. "The title is valid," I said. "The property now falls under a revised ownership clause. All usage requires my sign-off, including events." Behind me, the concierge discreetly picked up the phone, likely calling the security lead not out of concern, but because protocol demanded it. "You knew we were planning this," my mother said, her voice low sudden. "You let us come all this way." "I did," I said, "because I wanted to see what it looked like, watching people walk into a house they never thought they'd have to earn." Mason stepped forward. "You're bluffing." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I pulled a folded sheet of paper from my coat pocket and handed it to him. It was a printed copy of the title confirmation, complete with digital timestamp notary seal and the trust clause reference. He read it, and his mouth tightened. Then he passed it to Trinity, who skimmed it with her jaw clenched. She had always been quick with comebacks, except when facts were involved. "You bought the estate," she whispered. "You really did it." "I didn't buy it," I said. I activated what was already mine. My mother placed her clipboard down on the desk as if it had become suddenly too heavy to hold. "We didn't think you'd want it." "You didn't ask," I said, voice flat. "You haven't asked me anything in years." They stood there, surrounded by designer luggage and carefully selected centerpieces looking more like event guests than family. People who had come to perform tradition, not honor it. "You're not seriously going to kick us out," Mason said, but even as he said it, doubt was in his eyes. "I'm not kicking anyone out," I replied, "but if you want to stay here, you'll need to check in under the actual rules, the same way any guest would. Which means I approve the list, I assign the rooms, I decide who has access." Trinity opened her mouth again, but the concierge interrupted politely. Should we proceed with reassigning guest privileges? Miss Brooks, I didn't look away from my brother. Yes, I said. Begin with the master suite. A ripple passed through them. Mason's face flushed a shade deeper. Trinity blinked too fast. My mother's hands twitched by her sides, grasping at an invisible script that was no longer valid. As I turned to head upstairs, I heard Mason mutter, "This isn't over." I paused just long enough to let the weight of the moment settle. "No," I said without turning. "This is finally beginning." I walked back up the stairs past the portraits of people who had always been framed on the walls but never truly known. And this time, I didn't look away. I let them see me finally not as the daughter they ignored, but as the one who now held the keys. The hallway on the second floor had always been a gallery. Every family home has one. A place where memories are framed and curated like a private museum, hand-picked moments meant to tell a story, but stories can lie. And the walls of the Brooks estate lied well. I hadn't walked this hall in over a decade, not since I'd been quietly asked to give space during Mason's engagement weekend. I remember standing here then holding a bottle of wine I'd bought on the drive up, realizing no one had saved me a room. My name wasn't on the guest list that time either. They blamed it on logistics. But this time I wasn't a guest. I was the owner. And the photos, well, now they were just evidence. The first frame I stopped at was from the summer I turned 16. We'd rented a sailboat for the day, and someone had snapped a picture of Mason at the helm, Trinity laughing at his side. The wind catching her hair just right. I remembered that day vividly because I was the one who planned it. Reserved the boat, packed the food, even steered half the trip, while Mason napped in the cabin. None of that made it into the photo. I wasn't in the shot at all. The next picture was Christmas 5 years later. Trinity holding her newborn Mason, pouring champagne. My mother smiling tightly like she was trying to freeze joy into her face. I was there too, I remembered, because I'd picked out the baby's outfit, but in the version on the wall, the photo had been cropped just right. My shoulder had been visible in the original. Now it was gone. Seamless, like I'd never been there at all. And that was their talent. Erasure without confrontation. They never told me to leave, they just stopped including me. In the room, the photo, the conversation, one crop at a time. I kept walking. More pictures, more curated fiction. In every one I saw the spaces where I'd been and been removed. A Thanksgiving dinner where I'd brought the centerpiece and wasn't in a single frame. A family retreat where I led the hike but was absent from the summit photo. An anniversary party I paid for, digitally omitted. In one frame, Mason and Trinity were posed on the front lawn with my father flanked by uncles and cousins. My father's hand rested on Mason's shoulder, his smile wide. I looked closer, the blur of fabric near the edge dark navy. That had been my dress. They had edited me out so carefully that the only trace left was a thread of color. I didn't feel pain anymore, that stage had passed. What I felt now was clarity. Their memory had always been selective. I had spent years thinking I was the problem, too serious, too distant, too professional. But what they actually resented was that I remembered the details they tried to forget. I kept track, and now that record had become my advantage. At the end of the hall was a photo I hadn't seen in years. It was the only one with my grandmother. She stood at the center of the dining room, hands resting on the back of her chair, head tilted slightly like she always did when she was about to make a joke. Around her, the rest of us sat frozen, mid-laugh, mouths open, eyes squinting. I was seated at her right. I remembered because she always insisted I sit there. First chair on the right, she used to say, belongs to the one who listens when no one else does. And yet, even in this photo, someone had moved the frame slightly, so the right edge, my edge, was barely visible. My face was cut off at the temple, not enough to draw attention, just enough to exclude me. I stood there for a while studying the way they had engineered my absence. They hadn't needed to raise their voices, they just needed to reposition the frame. And yet, here I was, standing in a house they no longer owned in a hallway, filled with memories they tried to curate, and now technically I had final say on what stayed and what didn't. But I didn't take anything down. I didn't remove a single frame. That would have made this about pettiness, and this was never about revenge in the loud sense. It wasn't about proving I was right. It was about showing them I had never disappeared. Instead, I walked back to the library. a room few people used anymore. It had been my father's favorite space, a mix of polished wood leather chairs and an old fireplace with a chipped marble mantel. On one of the lower shelves behind a dusty collection of Faulkner and Hemingway, I found the small leather photo album my grandmother used to keep. It was where she stored the unofficial photos, the ones that weren't meant for the hallway, the candid ones, the real ones. I sat on the old couch and opened it, page after page of snapshots they thought were lost. There I was at age 7 in a mud-covered dress from running in the fields. There I was, helping Grandma knead dough flour on my nose. There I was, age 19, standing in front of a podium after delivering my first big speech at the real estate conference she insisted I attend. These were the memories they never displayed, but she always had. I took out one photo, a small 4x6, slightly bent at the corners. It was me and Grandma sitting side by side on the porch swing. Her eyes were half closed in the sun, and I was mid-laugh, hair wild in the wind. No pose-in, no crop, no filter. I brought it with me back to the hallway. Without ceremony, I placed it on the small entry table below the main wall of portraits. No frame, just resting against the base of a lamp like a bookmark in a longer story. It didn't demand attention, it just existed. And that was the point. They could curate as much as they wanted. Stage, edit, crop, rewrite. But the house didn't lie, not anymore, and neither did the contract, or the deed, or the mail, or the silence. Upstairs I could hear Trinity pacing, doors opening and closing, Mason's voice frustrated low. My mother was likely in the dining room redrafting the seating chart like it still mattered. I walked away from the gallery wall slowly, letting the weight of the house settle into my steps, not heavy, just grounded. I wasn't trying to insert myself back into the story. I'd simply stopped letting them delete me. There's a difference. The wind had picked up outside, and a branch tapped against the window like a soft knock. I glanced back once at the wall of photos, now aware that the most important one sat beneath them all. The one they didn't choose. The one that wouldn't be removed. The one that reminded them I never left. They just stopped looking. It started with a knock, not on a door, but on the glass window that faced the front lawn of the estate. I was in the study reviewing catering invoices and confirming holiday staff and payroll when the flicker of motion outside caught my eye. A man with a camera stood on the lawn peering toward the house, his assistant motioning for him to stay in frame. A branded news van idled just behind them, its red logo unmistakable, its lights glaring into the early dusk. I didn't need to hear the intro to know how that the segment would go. That familiar rhythm of media drama, scandal, accusation, misdirection. When I opened the front door, the reporter's voice met me like an icy slap. "Miss Brooks," he said with a practiced manner, "can you confirm whether it's true that you coerced your elderly father into signing over the deed to the estate?" There it was, the weaponization of narrative. Behind him, the camera light blinked steadily, unforgiving. My mother must have made the call, or Trinity, or Mason. It didn't matter. The message was clear: they were losing control, so they reached for the only tool they had left: character assassination. I didn't answer the reporter. I simply closed the door and locked it. The estate fell into silence again, except for the rhythmic crackle of the fireplace in the study, and the muted hum of conversation drifting from the drawing room, where guests still clung to the illusion that this was a normal holiday gathering. Back in my room, my phone was already buzzing with texts and emails, a cease and desist draft, a formal petition from the family's lawyer, citing undue influence and mental incapacitation, a thinly veiled threat disguised as concern. They were claiming I had manipulated my late father into altering the family trust while he was in decline. The irony, of course, was that he hadn't touched the trust. My grandmother had, years before, so quietly, legally, precisely, and with the clarity only someone disillusioned by her own children could carry. But this move wasn't about winning in court. It was about discrediting me in public, contaminating the waters just enough that people wouldn't know what to believe. I sat on the edge of the bed, reading each line carefully. The language was slick, calculated. Mason had clearly had a hand in it. The goal was simple: force me to fold under pressure, smear me, make the estate toxic enough that I'd walk away just to protect my name. They didn't realize something important. I didn't get here because I wanted their approval. I got here because I stopped needing it. Within the hour, Savannah arrived. She was an attorney, former family friend, and the only person in the last decade who had stayed loyal to truth over bloodline. She walked in without removing her coat, a folder under one arm, and a USB drive in her other hand. "They're betting on you going quiet," she said. "You ready to make them regret that?" She didn't have to ask twice. We sat at the desk in the master suite, the walls around us still humming with decades of privilege and assumption. She plugged in the drive, pulled up the files, dozens of them, emails, voicemails, group chats, recordings. One in particular played softly over the speakers, Trinity's voice sharp and unmistakable. "She doesn't matter. She's always been a liability. If she wanted to be part of the family, she should have been easier to control." Another message, this time from my mother: "Don't feel guilty. She's used to being alone." Savannah paused the audio. Her face was unreadable. "I have a recorded video too," I said, "from 2 years ago. My father on the back porch, clear-headed, calm, saying exactly what he wanted, that the estate should go to the person who actually showed up. We played it." He spoke in that slow, deliberate tone he used when he was trying to be taken seriously. "Elena's the only one who ever asked how I was doing, not what I could give. She's the one I trust. This place should be hers. That alone would have been enough to sink their claim. But what followed was stronger timestamps, official records, mental competency evaluations from that same month, all clean. Their case wasn't just weak, it was built on fiction. Still, Savannah was thorough. She compiled everything, printed 3 full binders, and submitted the motion to dismiss that same night. We didn't wait. We didn't delay. We moved with the quiet speed of people who had nothing left to prove. The hearing was set for the following week. It wasn't flashy. There were no cameras allowed in the courtroom, no reporters in the gallery, just a judge with tired eyes, a clock ticking steadily above his head, and 2 rows of polished benches, half filled with my family, all dressed in cold shades of navy and beige. Mason looked straight ahead the whole time. Trinity kept tapping her phone until the bailiff told her to stop. My mother sat stiffly, hands clenched in her lap, as if decorum could still save her. I wore black, no jewelry, hair back, a steel-willed stillness wrapped around every movement. Their attorney spoke first. A carefully constructed argument about family confusion, grief, vulnerability. He used words like undue influence and irregular proceedings as if throwing dust would delay gravity. When it was our turn, Savannah stood. She said little. She let the evidence speak. She played the video, the audio. She handed over notarized affidavits. She outlined the terms of the trust established long before my father's health declined, solidified by my grandmother reviewed annually legally sound. When it ended, the judge looked over the rim of his glasses and said, "This is not a courtroom for family resentment. This is a courtroom for law. And the law is clear." He dismissed the petition without hesitation, without condition, no settlement, no mediation, just a clean win. Trinity whispered something as we walked past. I didn't stop to listen. Mason didn't even look up. My mother held her purse like a shield and stared straight ahead, as if the walls might tell her what to feel. Outside, the air felt colder than it had going in, but lighter too, like a storm that had finally spent itself. Savannah turned to me. "I'm way out now," she asked. "I thought about it, about all the options, all the ways to twist the knife, but I'd already done what mattered most. I hadn't fought to destroy them. I'd fought to stop shrinking for them. They had spent years trying to silence me, then years trying to punish me for surviving the silence. But the truth had its own voice. And this time, it echoed. I walked back to the car alone. No entourage, no fanfare. Just the steady rhythm of heels on courthouse stone, and a weight I no longer carried, not because it was lifted, because I had learned how to stand anyway. The day after the hearing, the house felt different. Not louder, not busier, just clearer, like a room where someone had finally cleaned the windows after years of smoke. The dust hadn't settled, it had been swept out. I walked barefoot through the hallway that morning, coffee in hand, passing by the same portraits that had watched me grow up and then tried to forget me. They no longer felt like threats, just relics. And as the sunlight poured through the large front windows, warming the old wood floors, I realized I didn't need to take anything down. I'd already reclaimed the frame they never let me fit into. Outside, the snow had melted in streaks. The path to the porch was wet glistening, as if the house itself had broken into a sweat after holding its breath for too long. I stepped onto the front deck and leaned against the post where the railing chipped. It had always chipped there, right where my grandmother used to tie her wind chimes every spring. They weren't store-bought, just twine and seashells we'd collect from the coast strung together in crooked, beautiful disarray. She had called them truth catchers, said that when the wind blew through something honest, it made a different sound. I hadn't thought about them in years, but that morning I remembered. I went to the storage room off the side of the garage, the one with old winter gearboxes of unused holiday decor and half-forgotten life. I found the bin almost immediately. It was labeled in my grandmother's handwriting porch, "Summer Chimes." Inside, tangled in tissue and dust, lay one of our original wind chimes. The string was frayed. A few of the shells had cracked. One of the sea glass beads was missing, leaving a lonely loop of empty twine. But it was still here. It had survived even quietly, like me. I sat on the porch and began unraveling it, laying each piece across the bench. I didn't try to replace what was broken. I just worked with what was left, cleaned what I could, reinforced the weak spots, threaded a new knot where the old one had worn thin. It took nearly an hour. And when it was done, I stood up and tied it to the porch beam, just where it had always hung. The wind didn't move it right away, but then a soft gust came cold, but clean, and the shells clicked against each other, a soft clatter that felt older than language. That was the sound of something honest. I sat back, cradling my coffee, letting the breeze move through it again and again. They had all left the house by then. Mason drove back to Boston with his ego dented and phone calls unanswered. Trinity stayed just long enough to post one final filtered photo, caption, "Family first," then slipped away in her white Audi. My mother didn't say goodbye. She didn't need to. The absence was the most honest thing she'd offered in years. The estate was mine now, not just on paper, but in air, in breath, in space. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt whole. There's a difference. And when Savannah returned later that afternoon, grocery bag in one hand and a bottle of wine in the other, she said nothing at first. She just stood next to me looking at the wind chime. "You fixed it," she said. "No," I replied. I let it sound again. We cooked dinner slowly that evening. No rush, no audience. Just two women rinsing off the residue of other people's expectations. We folded linens together, scrubbed the countertops Trinity had once claimed for her elaborate charcuterie boards, laughed quietly at the absurdity of it all, how much noise they made trying to act like I didn't matter, and how little it took to show I always had. Later, we sat on the back porch watching the sky shift into shades of pink and violet. The fire pit crackled low, and the sound of the wind chime drifted softly around the corner. We didn't speak for a long while, and we didn't need to. Some victories don't need to be narrated. Some justice doesn't roar, it hums quietly like wind through a line of broken shells, and maybe that's the kind that lasts. Savannah nudged me gently. "You could have burned it all down," she said. "I know," I said, "but then I would have missed the sound." Have you ever realized that healing didn't mean vengeance, but finally hearing your own voice again? Comment 1, if you understand that kind of silence. Or 2, if you think justice should be loud. As night settled and the wine glass warmed in my hands, I thought about how easy it would have been to let the bitterness calcify, to let it harden into something as sharp, but that would have meant I was still holding their story. Instead, I chose mine, and it didn't need to be angry. It just needed to ring true. The day after Christmas, the estate was quiet, not the kind of silence that feels empty, but the kind that feels earned. The staff had gone home early. The halls were free of voices, and for the first time in years, the house didn't feel like it was holding its breath. It simply existed, with me in it. I walked through each room slowly, one by one, not to inspect, not to reclaim, but to acknowledge. The library still carried the faint scent of leather and paper. The dining room cleared of centerpieces, and tension looked almost soft in the winter light. In the sunroom, a blanket lay folded neatly over the arm of a chair. Someone had used it recently, probably without thinking, but now it was mine to refold. I ended in the room that had once been mine as a child. The door still creaked in the middle, the floor still groaned near the bed. The bookshelf stood where I'd left it, mostly forgotten. I scanned the titles: Science Kits, Outdated School Yearbooks, a small frame photo of me and my father when I was about 7. In the picture, he's crouched beside me, our eyes squinted into the sun. I'm grinning, missing 2 front teeth. He's pointing at something in the distance. I never remembered what. They hadn't taken the photo down. They'd just left it to gather dust. I picked it up and wiped the glass with the sleeve of my sweater. For a moment, I wondered what he would have said if he'd lived to see this, to see me sitting at the head of the table holding the pen, the deed, the name. I wasn't sure. He hadn't been one for big speeches in private, but I remember something he told me once when I was 10 and came home crying after Trinity took credit for a science fair project we both knew I built. He knelt beside me, placed a small shell in my hand, and said, "You don't need to shout to prove what you built. Just make sure it still stands when they're done bragging. That shell still lived in the top drawer of my desk." That lesson, too. It wasn't revenge I wanted when I came back. It wasn't even justice, not in the traditional sense. I wanted the silence to be mine again. Not a punishment, not a sentence, just a space I didn't have to explain. I spent that morning drafting a letter to the estate board outlining a new set of values for future use of the property. No more exclusive guest lists, no more decisions made in closed-door meetings, no more legacy built on curated stories and selective memory. The house would still host holidays, but it would also host scholarships, youth retreats, writing residencies, things that created value for people who didn't have to share a last name to feel welcomed. This legacy would be earned, not inherited. When I was done writing, I went to the porch. The wind chime rang gently above me, the sound as steady as breath. Then came the knock. Not sharp, not frantic, just steady, measured. I opened the front door to find Mrs. Donnelly, the neighbor from 2 houses down, holding a tin of lemon bars and a scarf draped across her forearm. "I thought you might be cold," she said with a smile. "And I heard what they tried to do. You held your ground, sweetheart. Your grandmother would have been proud." I thanked her. We stood on the porch for a moment, the kind of quiet shared only by people who don't need to fill it. "You know," she added softly, "your father used to talk about you more than the others. Told me once you were the only one who asked about tide charts at age 6. That girl thinks in tides," he said. I never forgot that. She handed me the scarf and walked away without waiting for a reply. Some people understand dignity without needing to be taught. I wrapped the scarf around my neck and sat on the porch, watching the sun sink slowly behind the trees. I wasn't waiting for anyone to arrive. I wasn't hoping for an apology. I had outgrown those cravings. I just wanted to sit in a place that had tried to forget me and let it remember. The old me would have wanted closure, would have drafted the perfect monologue in her head, rehearsed what to say if Mason called, if Trinity reached out, if my mother finally showed up with tears and an excuse, but none of them did, and I was fine with that. Sometimes the loudest vindication is absence. Sometimes the most complete healing is when you stop needing the people who broke you to say your name. You say it for yourself, and you let the walls listen. As dusk settled into dark, I turned off the lights one room at a time. The chandelier in the foyer, the sconces in the library, the fireplace, the upstairs hallway. No rush, no performance, just quiet, deliberate motion. I saved the porch light for last. Standing there in the stillness, I looked out at the snow-covered trees, the gravel driveway now empty, the echo of their voices long gone. And then I turned the switch. The light blinked once and held. This house had belonged to them once, to their rules, their version of truth, their fear of being challenged. And now it belonged to someone who had been left off the list, erased from the photos, excluded from the table, and who came back anyway. Not to demand a seat, but to buy the whole damn room. Have you ever realized that the most powerful thing you can do isn't taking revenge, but reclaiming what they hoped you'd abandon? Comment 1 if you know that kind of power, or 2 if you think some things should just be left behind. I closed the door, not to shut them out, but to finally be inside, on my terms. And this time the silence was mine. Some stories don't need to be shouted to be heard. Some journeys don't begin with a grand entrance, they begin with silence. The kind of silence that stretches long enough, deep enough to turn hurt into resolve. Elena didn't fight back with rage. She didn't beg for recognition or demand apologies. She prepared. She signed. She waited, and she walked into the house that once refused her with the title in her hand. This wasn't a victory because they finally saw her. It was a victory because she no longer needed them to. If you've ever been left out of the table, the group, or the room you thought you belonged in, know this: you're not alone. People like Elena, like many of us, have been pushed aside, written off, or edited out. But some of us chose not to stay gone. We chose to rise, not with noise, but with certainty. Because there's a kind of power that comes from silence, a kind that doesn't ask for validation, a kind that doesn't flinch. And when that silence walks back in confident, unbothered, uninvited, it speaks louder than any accusation. Have you ever walked away quietly, only to come back stronger? Share your story in the comments. 1, if you've lived it. 2, if you're still finding your way. We read every single one. Sometimes the loudest justice doesn't echo in a courtroom or in an argument. It arrives in stillness, in knowing your name is finally on the door, and that you didn't need anyone's permission to walk through it, 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 permission to walk through it.